All industries pick up jargon and acronyms and various indecipherable bits of language as they exist. Today, let's start what might turn out to be an infinite part series to talk specifically about the business jargon in the games industry. We'll come back and do one about the more game-focused terms. For today, let's focus specifically on the business terms. I'm going to shift over just a bit to give myself some space over here. Boop. There we go. So first, let's talk profitability. Gross profit is just the amount of money you have left after you've paid for getting the game onto shelves. The only thing that's typically in there is cost of goods and services. Interestingly, though, it isn't always consistent. Sometimes other things are lumped in there as well. Sometimes COGS isn't actually even in there, and it is basically just the money that comes through the door. But for proper accounting purposes, it means the money you have left after you've paid to get the thing onto shelves. So COGS specifically, cost of goods and services. Net profit is your gross profit with everything else taken out. How much it costs to make the game, how much it costs to market it, all of these different things. Above the line is everything that affects gross profit, whatever you are using to arrive at that gross profit number. And then below the line is everything else. So if a cost is above the line, it's going to reduce your gross profit, and if it's below the line, it's only going to reduce your net profit. And depending on the bits of accounting that your organization is doing internally, it might be very desirable to have something above the line because it is seen as something that can't be modified, something that can't be squeezed, versus below the line where it's seen as something that is up to the team to control and therefore can be pushed upon. But that's going to really depend on your organization and how they are trying to get you to control what you're spending. When we're talking about costs, we already talked about above the line and below the line. OCOR is an increasingly commonly used term. It means ongoing cost of revenue. So for a live service, this includes the cost of keeping the servers running. It includes the cost of the people that do your tech support. If your game requires people to play the game professionally, it may include that cost. Whatever you are doing on an ongoing basis would be considered OCOR. In the case of live services, especially mobile live services, I believe they would include their ongoing marketing acquisition costs as an OCOR cost. But I'm not super familiar with the accounting in that case, so I'm not 100% sure about that. COGS is cost of goods and services. In most cases, this means the cost of actually manufacturing the box and getting it into the stores. For games from digital stores, the 30% that the digital storefront takes is usually not considered a COG because it's just seen as non-revenue, in that if I sell a game for $10 on Steam, I only see $7 of that. So rather than accounting it as $10 with $7 of gross profit, it's usually just accounted as being $7. One of the reasons you care about these different things is because you want to try to control things like inventory risk. If you have a very expensive product that costs a lot to make, then you have inventory risk. If it costs me $1,000 to make something that I can sell for $1,080, even though I make $80 of profit, every single instance I don't sell is essentially losing me $1,000. Whereas for something that is purely digital, there's no such inventory risk. If the digital storefront is charging me $1,000 of transactional fees for my $1,080 product, I'm making $80. Any product I don't sell doesn't cost me anything. There's no inventory risk. So as a result, it makes sense that you take into account COGS for physical goods where you're taking on a risk, but not necessarily for digital goods where that risk doesn't really exist. Ultimately, a lot of this comes down to what the organization is usually most concerned about, which is return. You hear the term ROI, which means return on investment. Return on investment is, if I am going to spend X number of dollars, what's the multiple of X that I am getting back for spending my money? This is broken down and presented in different ways in different organizations. EA used terms like responsibility profit and operating contribution as cuts on ROI. What they're doing in those cases is they're removing the costs that the team doesn't have direct control over, or at least some of them, and then doing a calculation of your profitability based upon how much you are spending, usually mostly driven by cost of people, and then dividing that into the total amount of gross profit you made as your title came out, or some modified version of gross profit. Again, the goal here being to try to drive the teams to drive their costs down, but also to drive their revenue up, but also extract some of the costs that they don't actually have direct control over. In most cases, there are still things in there that the team doesn't actually have control over. So I personally found it as a number that seemed a little arbitrary and made up, which arguably all of these numbers are, but that's what the organization ultimately cares about, is making their margins as high as possible, making as much money as they can for every dollar that they spend. When these things are calculated, they're calculated with two numbers being relevant. The percentage of your ROI or RP or OC, so that is for this much money that we spent or made, we made 3 times that, or 50% more than we spent, or 20% more than we spent. And then raw magnitude. We spent $5 million, we made $25 million. The reason why the organization usually will consider both of these numbers is because a high percentage is really great, but there's a certain amount of friction that's introduced for every product or project that you have on the go in your organization. So something that has near 100% profitability can sometimes still get shut down in larger organizations if the magnitude isn't big enough, because it's seen as friction, as a distraction, as a thing that's keeping the organization from spending its effort and attention on other things. I personally think that this is pretty short-sighted and can result in organizations shutting down moneymakers just because they are not making enough money. This can result in organizations shutting down things that are fairly profitable, have a high percentage ROI, but aren't making a large enough magnitude. Or vice versa, where they will shut down a project that makes a large amount of money, but the profitability isn't very great. Organizations, in my experience, if the magnitude is sufficiently large, even if the margins are pretty poor, will usually find an excuse to keep it running. This is more often than not used as an excuse to shut down the fairly profitable but fairly small things within an organization, as opposed to the other way around. Present value of money is the concept that money that you have today and can put to use on various things. If I need to spend money on something in order to make that money a long time in the distance, when I'm calculating how much it's worth to me today, I have to discount that money. This is actually something that games and studios with really long lead times struggle with within larger organizations. Because if you're going to spend 5, 6, 7 years on a game, then the present value of that potential return is quite a bit diminished, because what the organization is thinking is, well, we could just spend the money we're going to spend on you on something we're going to ship in 12 months. Those of you who actually looked at the balance sheets of a lot of the big publishers will notice that they're not actually doing that. They actually have money sitting around in most cases. So it's kind of an imaginary argument they're having with themselves when they're discounting revenue that's fairly far down the road. And it can lead to pretty short-sighted behavior on the part of big organizations, because they're chasing things that will return money right away, as opposed to potentially spending bigger money on longer strategic investments that may not pay off for a much longer time. When you amortize, what you're doing is you're spreading the cost of something across over its life cycle. EA doesn't actually amortize its costs, but Activision does. If it costs $100 million to make a game, then it says this game is going to sell for 24 months, and using some sort of formula spreads that cost across those 24 months. This makes it so that you are incurring the costs over the course of the sales of the project. Now, of course, you had to come up with the money when you were actually investing it, so it's a bit of an accounting trick, more than anything. And it also means that you can end up in a situation where a game comes out and you've amortized all these costs to it. And if a game doesn't sell very well and you need to cut that 24 months down to 12 months, then you need to write that down. You need to take that remaining cost and incur it all at once in a write down. It potentially reflects the reality of the way that the games industry works a bit better, but it's more complicated, and it means that you can end up in a situation where you have these costs that you then suddenly have to incur all at once because your game isn't selling very well and you're cutting the tail off for the accounting system. I feel like these two different approaches, amortizing the cost versus not amortizing the cost, probably do affect the culture of the studios that do one versus the other. I could certainly imagine that for EA, it makes them more concerned about costs because they're incurring them right now when there's no money coming back to cover those costs. But I'm not 100% sure that that's actually the case. So once your game comes out, you have data surrounding that game and how it's doing. Things that you will see are DAU, MAU, and session days. So DAU is on a given day, how many people are playing the game, or at least turning it on. Monthly active users, same idea, but over the entirety of a month. And these things are used to try to measure the health of a live service, or even just measure the health of a game that's recently come out. Session days is the number of different days that a person has logged into this game. It's used as a proxy for how engaging the game is, and sometimes it's used to calculate revenue share for subscriptions. I don't like session days as a proxy for player engagement because it is actually relatively easy to game, and you see a lot of mobile games that do lots of things to encourage you to log in every single day, even if it's only for a couple of minutes. Forming habits is actually powerful, so there's something to be said for paying attention to how many different days you can get someone to play your game, or at least turn it on, and it's worth thinking about. I'm just not convinced that it's the right way to be dividing up revenue, because if someone logs into your deep RPG and plays it literally 24 hours a day for 4 days straight, that's 4 session days. If someone logs into your live service game every day for 10 minutes for 28 days, that's 28 session days, even though they played less than 5 hours over those 28 days. So I do think it's deeply flawed, but for the people making the deep RPGs that encourage people to essentially binge play them, it's worth thinking about trying to figure out ways to spread out that engagement, because if you can spread that 4-day binge over even 8 days, you're less likely to burn that player out, and you're more likely to have a longer engagement in your franchise. It's worth thinking about. I just think it can be overused within the business parts of the games industry. When we talk about live service, we start talking about a lot of different acronyms. So ASP is actually not exactly a live service term. It's the average sales price, and it usually means the average price that someone bought your box product at the store for. Usually ends up at about somewhere around $30, but this can also be used in weird ways. On Dragon Age Origins, it started to be used to refer to the price of the game that the person bought plus the value of all the DLC that they bought. So Dragon Age Origins ASP is like $38, which isn't to say that the average copy of the game they bought was $38. More so, it means that they bought the game for some price and then they bought enough DLC to bring that ASP up to $38, which is really using ASP more as the next term, which is LTV, which is lifetime value, which refers to this person engaged in your game in some way. How much money did they spend over their entire time engaging with your property? This is a broader term that is useful because it actually is able to deal with lots of different kinds of business. If it's an MMO, this is the cost of the box potentially, plus all of the months they subscribed, plus any MTX they bought. If this is a free-to-play game, it's all the MTX that they bought. If this is a traditional box product with some DLC, it's the ASP of the box product plus the value of all of the DLC that they purchased. So this is a more better generic term that allows you to integrate and aggregate all of the different possible ways that you make money into a single term. When you get really deep into the way that we talk about live services, you have three terms, two of which actually mean the same thing. You have ARPU, ARPPU, and ARPS. ARPU is average revenue per user. So this is the total amount of money that you make divided by your total number of users. It's not taking into account the fact that some of your users aren't spending any money. Usually this number is quite low because only a small percentage of your players are actually spending that much money or even any money at all, which is why you also have ARPPU and ARPS, which mean the same thing. I like ARPPU because you have to say PPU. That's average revenue per paying user and average revenue per spender. They mean exactly the same. And this is once you've managed to convert a player into a spender, how much money do they spend? Some games have a very high conversion rate, meaning that they are able to make a large percentage of their players spend some money, but then the amount of money that those players spend isn't very high. Other games have a relatively low conversion rate, but then end up with very high ARPPUs, meaning that once they convert you, you're much more likely to spend a lot of money. These are where the terms that you hear like Minnow and Dolphin and whale come from, because for a lot of free-to-play franchises, they make the vast majority of their money from their whales, meaning that a very, very small percentage of their players make more than 90% of their total revenue, which if you are someone who is not spending on that game, means you have to ask yourself what purpose you serve to that company, because you're costing them something. You have to wonder if you are somehow part of the service they are offering now. When you're a free-to-play game, you're constantly trying to acquire new players, which gives you two additional terms, CPA and CAC. CPA is the cost to get the person to install your game or potentially play your game. There's a couple of other terms that differentiate between install versus play, but basically for our purposes, this is the cost to acquire a new player. And then with CAC is the cost of acquiring a new customer. So that's how much money you have to spend to get someone new that's going to actually spend some money. What you often find with live service games is they have a really strong understanding of these two terms. They've done tons of A/B research. They've really dug in on this, and what they found is that when they spend X dollars, they can get a new player, and on average, that new player is going to spend Y dollars. As long as X is smaller than Y, that game can continue to make money. When you look at free-to-play games that have been around for a long time and seem to be constantly advertising, basically what they've discovered is that if they spend a large amount of money, they can acquire a large amount of players, and those players are going to spend more money than it costs to acquire them. Very likely those games have very high churn, meaning that people are playing for only a short period of time, but they're still spending more than they're putting into the machine. So essentially what they've got is a machine that you put $5 in and it spits $5.25 out the other side, and they're just turning the crank of that machine as fast as they can to generate as much money as is possible. Over time, what will happen is your cost per acquisition will slowly climb higher and higher because you're going to exhaust your potential player base. And potentially you're also going to acquire less engaged players, which means even as your cost per acquisition is going up, less and less of those people are actually converting into spenders. So the amount of money you're making per acquisition is also going down. And once those two lines cross, that's basically when the live service is no longer viable. Big organizations have big leadership teams, and you'll hear it called the C-suite. The C-suite is essentially the team of people whose titles start with C. C meaning chief. Typical C-suite members that you will see are CEO, the chief executive officer. They're basically the head of the company, sort of. The chief finance officer, they're the person in charge of all the accounting services. CMO, chief marketing officer, so they are probably in charge of also all public relations, but definitely they're in charge of all the marketing. CTO is the person in charge of technology at an organization. At a video game company, they probably are also responsible for any engine research that is being done. CCO is chief compliance officer, so you are a publicly traded company likely, so you need someone that makes sure that you aren't on the wrong side of the Security and Exchange Commission, the SEC. This can be a surprisingly powerful job. Often companies have some more that aren't as common. You might end up with a chief competition officer because you've decided to move into esports, or you've got a chief creative officer which kind of leads us over to the garden vacation. So the garden vacation is the idea that when you leave an organization, that organization pays you for some period of time to basically still be an employee and be bound by the rules of an employee, but not really going to work anymore. In England, this is actually done with a lot of people, relatively junior people. But in North America, this is basically only done for the very most senior people. The reason why you put someone on a garden vacation, or alternatively make up a position for them to be at the company while their stock finishes vesting, is to prevent them from going to another organization, to prevent them from bringing what they know to a competitor. I was not on a garden vacation when I left BioWare. As I said, it's actually quite rare in North America. So now that you're a publicly traded company, that comes with a whole extra set of jargon all its own. GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles, is the accounting methodology used in the United States. And then you have the IFRS, which is the International Financial Reporting Standards, which is the competing standard to GAAP that's used throughout most of the rest of the world. I'm not an accountant. My understanding of the primary difference between GAAP and IFRS is this. GAAP is something like 8,000 pages long, and the IFRS is something more like 30 pages long. As a result, they're philosophically quite different things. What you will often see American companies do is when they are reporting their earnings, they will have their GAAP reporting, which they legally have to have as a publicly traded company. But they may also have an additional amendum, which is Non-Gaap, which is them saying effectively, this is what the way we have to report our numbers, but we believe that our business is better represented by looking at the numbers in this different way. Here are our non-GAAP financials. That makes sense on the surface, and I think there's something to it. But of course, because non-GAAP is essentially not a regulated reporting system, you can end up with some shenanigans in the non-GAAP numbers. So you need to be careful when you're looking entirely at non-GAAP numbers. You probably need to add the context of the GAAP accounting on top of it in order to understand what the heck is going on with this company. Percentage institutionally owned, we're getting into stock market stuff here. This is the percentage of the company that is owned by big organizations, by hedge funds, by investment funds, by big movers and shakers within the financial world. When you look at EA and Activision, this percentage is really, really high, approaching 100%. Not quite 100%, but it gets really close. Meaning that these companies are held by and controlled by relatively small groups of people with very large amounts of money that they're throwing around. Earnings per share is literally the amount of money that the company actually made, net, divided by the total number of shares that are outstanding in the company. This is often used as part of the calculation by investors as to what the company is worth. You don't see diluted earnings as much within video games. Diluted earnings are essentially what the earnings per share would be if every single thing that isn't quite a stock got turned into a stock. This is things like stock options. When BioWare got bought by EA, they were still using stock options quite a bit, but now they've largely moved away from that. So the difference between the EPS and the diluted EPS for a company like EA is pretty much zero, very close to zero. But for some other companies, especially startups in the tech sector, the difference between these two could actually be ginormous. There could be huge amounts of options sitting out in the world that if they were all converted would increase the number of stocks by a massive amount. I've talked about revenue recognition in the past, but basically it means this. There's a difference between when you have a dollar coming into your business and when you're allowed to count it as revenue. Because potentially you've been paid up front for something that you're not delivering for a long period of time. If I am buying a year of subscription in something up front, then the rules basically say that I can only recognize the revenue every month for the month that I've now delivered for that subscription, which in a lot of ways makes a lot of sense, because if I don't deliver on that subscription, I may have to refund the remaining portion of that subscription that they paid for upfront. With very conservative accounting organizations, which I would definitely count EA as one of, you can also result in these weird kind of head fakes that you can get. The reason why I've talked about revenue recognition before is because I triggered what could have become a revenue recognition issue on Dragon Age Inquisition. Shortly after the game came out, but close to a quarter edge, I think it was probably February as we were approaching the end of the fiscal year, I dated a patch that was coming out, but that patch was coming out on the other side of the fiscal boundary. By the very, very most conservative interpretation of revenue recognition, you could argue that someone bought this game entirely to get that patch. Therefore, we can't recognize the revenue for the entire game until that patch is delivered. And because it's across a fiscal boundary, it means we have to defer the revenue across the fiscal boundary. Oh no, it's going to ruin our fiscal year because we're going to have to defer all this revenue. Obviously, that's kind of ridiculous. There are lots of different ways why you would argue that that's not actually the case. In fairness to the accounting team at EA, making those arguments is a pain in the ass. So better off not to have to make them in the first place, rather than having to argue that, well, no, this person did not pay $60 entirely to get this patch that is about to be delivered. It probably didn't factor into their buying decision at all. But even if it did factor into their buying decision, it only should have factored into their buying decision 1%. So rather than deferring $60 of revenue, we're going to defer 60 cents of revenue. Pain in the ass to do that. So that's why you try to avoid doing things that are going to force you to defer your revenue across any kind of fiscal boundary. Two last ones. Moral hazard is the sense that you can get into a position where an organization, usually a corporation, is acting irresponsibly because it's protected from its own downside, either because the corporation is too big to fail or because it's put insurance in place, and it can result in the company acting without due concern because it has essentially no downside. In most cases, this is not a problem within the video game industry. Video game companies are not too big to fail, and they haven't been able to get themselves into a position where they're protecting themselves from their own bad actions. But this is something that happened back in 2008 when the banks essentially started acting irresponsibly and they were prevented from failing because they were too big to fail. The consequences of their failure would have been catastrophic to the world as a whole, and as a result, we were in a situation of moral hazard. Fiduciary responsibility is something that I feel that a lot of people misinterpret. All it really means is that the directors of the company are supposed to act in the interest of the corporation first, not to be putting their own self-interests before the interests of the corporation. A lot of people seem to interpret this as meaning corporations need to make money right now, all the time, every time, which is not what it means. It means that they should be putting the corporation first. But putting the corporation first doesn't necessarily mean always thinking short term. It doesn't mean thinking in this quarter to quarter way. It can mean saying we are going to take a year off and lose money and restructure because it's going to make us a healthier and more sustainable corporation long term. But so much in the West, it's started to be taken as meaning companies need to put profit first no matter what, with no long-term thinking. But of course, you're not really putting the corporation first if you have no long-term thinking. Having a company that was very profitable and drove the planet into a nuclear wasteland was not really putting the corporation first in the long term at all, was it? Obviously, I'm not an accountant. I've probably gotten some of these terms wrong. Hopefully not very, very wrong, but if I have, let me know that down in the comments as well. For those of you who are not familiar with finance, this all might feel like it's just pushing numbers around. And to some degree, that's actually kind of true. It's just that in big organizations, just pushing some numbers around is an incredibly important job. That's it for today. I imagine that this can be an infinitely many-part project. If you found this interesting, let me know that down in the comments, and throw any other bits of jargon you want to hear discussed down there as well, and we'll see. We might do another one right away. As I said up front, we will do one on more gameplay and game-focused terminology as well. Special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link to that down in the description. If you found this interesting, in addition to leaving a comment with your own bits of jargon you want defined, give this video a thumbs up because that will also help YouTube share it with more people. I will see you again soon. Thank you.